Hi, my name is Linda and welcome to the Bible Talks. This episode we will continue on the topic of why we need salvation to talk about what happened after the flood. In the last episode we talked about the genealogy of Noah and his family, and I said I would have a picture to show you, so let me get that. Let's see. Picture for you. Don't know if you're going to see this or not, but in this, put my laptop down a little bit. Fix this for you. Hold on. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, but for the genealogy of Noah and his family after the flood, remember I said that genetically, somehow or another, someone brought the gene or that trait for giants onto the ark as it was passed through the flood to people after the flood. So we know Noah's genealogy, and we talked about his family background, but we don't know anything about Mrs. Noah. So what I was saying yesterday, so Noah, being considered perfect by God, has the gene which says he is completely 100% human. So he had two big H's in his gene pool for as far as height and stature, okay, and the giant gene. He did not have it. He had two big H's, but his wife, since we don't know her background, we have to say that she had to have a recessive gene, which would be an H, big H, little h. So those two have children. So they have three sons. They have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So if you take one gene from each parent, so you would end up with something like this. So Shem, which would be the first son listed here, would have a big H from his dad and a big H from his mom, which would give him 100% human genetic makeup. And then you have Ham, who would have a big H from his dad and a small h from his mom, which would give him the trait for the genetic gene for giants. And then you have Japheth, who would be the next son. He'd have a big H from his dad, a big H from his mom. So he'd have the genes which would be completely the human traits for that particular size and stature. So he'd have the normal genes. So then they have children, because they were married. But we're focusing on Ham because Ham had the recessive gene. He had the big H and a little h. So looking at his lineage, if he were to marry someone, which he evidently did, that had also a recessive trait, a big H and a little h, Mrs. Ham had to have that. They had 4 children. So the first son was Cush, and then you had Mizraim, then you had Phut, and then you had Canaan. So Cush would get 2 H's, one from his dad, one from his mom. So he'd have the 2 H's, which is the normal gene pool for height and stature. Then you had his brother Mizraim, who would get a big H from his dad and a little h from his mom. And he would have a recessive trait there for the gene for the giant. And then you'd have Phut, who would also have, at that point, I guess Phut would have either 2 big H's or 1 little h and 1 big H. I can't remember since I can't see it, but he would be either, he would have the trait, I think, for the genetic makeup as far as the giant is concerned. And then you'd have Canaan, who would be the last child, the last son to receive the genetic pool contribution from his parents, and he ended up having the 2. He had ended up with the 2 little h's, which means that he definitely had the genetic pool and the trait for giants. And then the Bible calls him, he was the father of giants. So as far as that was concerned, that's why I said in the last video that he was the unlucky one. He got that lottery for that trait and ended up having that particular gene be manifested in his people, in all the people that came out of Canaan. That's where you would see the giants, okay, out of Canaan's pool, out of his descendants and his family, okay. All these sons had children. I mean, they had 4 or 5 or more children, I think, as far as Noah's sons are concerned. So Canaan, of all the children, was the one that would have been born to Ham with that particular gene, because the other 2 sons did not have that gene, okay? So that's my theory as far as the genetic part of it. And I'm not a geneticist or biologist. I just remember from studying how genes and traits are passed from parents to sibling. And that's the conclusion that I came with as far as how Canaan ended up being called the father of giants. So after the flood, what we have now is this genealogy to deal with. And this particular genealogy has caused massive speculation over the years, a lot of negative feelings over the years around the racial and the sexual implications associated with the passages that concern Canaan and the giants and all of that. And the reason it's been such a big deal is because if you think about it, you know, in the context of Canaan's curse, this whole curse that was placed on him in the Bible, where he would be the servant of servants and that kind of thing, was really perverted by people for their own purposes, to justify the mistreatment of people and the institution of slavery, racism, things like that in this country, in the U.S., and also in other parts of the world. There's always been servitude and servants from the time, you know, from the beginning. But on the scale that it was used, scriptures were used to justify something as horrible as the mistreatment of people that still goes on today in some parts of the world. It was really not what was far-reaching and far beyond what the scriptures had intended at the time this curse was mentioned against Canaan. And it is important for us to keep in mind, too, that as far as God was concerned, his goal was to preserve one specific race. And his goal was to preserve the human race so that the Messiah could be born as a redeemer for all of us. That was his focus, and his concern was that the corruption, the wickedness had gotten so bad that if it were allowed to continue, it would be hard to have that initial prophecy fulfilled if the genetic pool had been polluted to the point where there weren't any people who had whole traits for pure human characteristics, other than, you know, the others that they were getting with the hybrids and such. So his plan for redemption, you know, and looking at it that way, would be extended to every living person equally. I mean, it wasn't going to be exclusive to anyone, especially when you get to the New Testament and the New Covenant. You can see where that was made manifest. But his whole goal was to have some humans, you know, some 100% human people left. And that was the whole point of everything that he was doing. It wasn't race or him trying to separate Israel from the other people because they were a different race or anything like that. It was to preserve the human race. So after the flood, there was this great rebellion. people didn't get it. People don't get it now. And so if you look over in Genesis chapter 11, it talks about what it was like at that time after the flood. In Genesis chapter 11, I'm trying to keep track of my time here too, talks about this guy. Well, it doesn't mention anyone by name, but it does talk about the rebellion, verses 1 through 4, what was happening. And that what was happening at that time, that there was one language. Everybody in the world at that time spoke one language, okay? One speech, one language. But somewhere along the line, men, under the leader of a man, decided that they would go and build, make bricks and start building this tower. So the purpose of building the tower was so it could reach into heaven. And they wanted to make a name for themselves. Because if they didn't make a name for themselves, they said, well, we might be scattered around the world and no one ever know who we were, so we need to do this and make a name for ourselves. So the man who led this rebellion, according to the historical accounts of Jasher chapter 9, was Nimrod. And Nimrod is a descendant, or was a descendant, of Ham. He was a son of Cush, I believe. He's one of Cush's sons. And so we know that God responded to that rebellion by destroying that tower, the Tower of Babel. And you can read about that in the Bible. And he also confused the languages so that the people couldn't communicate anymore. So that was when, that's when the diversity of languages came about, because of that incident of building this tower. And then there was the Great Dispersion, where he scattered people all around the earth. So up until that point, everybody was together, everybody was of one people. But when this happened, there was a Great Dispersion. So that's when you get people, when I said before about Japheth's people going on over to Europe, and you got the Arab peoples in general coming out of Shem, and then you've got the African and Egyptian and other nations coming out of Ham. That's what I meant when the dispersion occurred. These people just kind of scattered. And 70 nations were born out of this dispersion. And these 70 nations actually made up what is considered the Gentile world. And so if you are not of Jewish heritage or Jewish descent, then you are of a Gentile heritage. Your background is Gentiles. And so that would include anybody that's not of the Israeli or Jewish genealogy or heritage, if you weren't born Jewish and that kind of thing. You can become Jewish, you can convert to Judaism and things like that. But I meant having that being your ancestry, Jewish ancestry or Jewish history. Anybody outside of that group of people would be considered Gentiles. So all of us, me, anybody else who's outside fits that category would be Gentile. So essentially, God gave spiritual dominion over the entire world. At that point, he gave it all over to Satan. And that's very important, because he gave that dominion to him, and in turn created a nation for himself. And remember, we talked about that, and I can't remember if it was in one of these earlier videos or in the last series, where he created a nation within a nation. So he created a nation of people that were human, 100% human people. The lineage was very important of keeping that, so that he could keep that bloodline pure. And that's talked about in Deuteronomy as well. And I had a note about that. Let's see. Why did I choose that? So for everybody else and for the world in general, that's how Satan came to be the one who's called the prince of the power of the air, like dominion, like the world being his dominion. So the world as we know it, as we see it, is really Satan's dominion. It was given to him by God. God just turned it over to him after the Great Dispersion. So if you look at Deuteronomy 32 and 8 and 9, it talks about how God divided the nations and separated the people, And for his portion, Jacob is a lot of his inheritance. And Jacob is the other name for Israel. So God's own personal inheritance, his own personal nation, his own chosen nation is Israel. From back then, and that hasn't changed since time has moved forward. It has not changed. He has not changed from that. So everybody else, all of the rest of us, are these Gentiles. All right, so protecting the bloodline is very important to God, as we have just talked about. And I want to talk about that some more, but I think we will do that in the next video. And I will stop here, and we will conclude on the topic about after the flood and pick up about how God protects the bloodline in the next video. Thank you so much. This has been the Bible Talks.